Some people should never sit at a $75 billion table. Richard Whitmore's voice rolled across the ballroom with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent his entire life being applauded for cruelty disguised as sophistication. The laughter came softly at first, scattered between crystal glasses and polished silverware, but it spread quickly beneath the chandeliers of the Manhattan Regent Hotel until the entire investor row seemed to glow with amusement. Naomi Carter didn't move. She stood at the center of the stage beneath the white conference lights, one hand resting lightly on the black leather merger folder in front of her, while camera flashes burst across the room like distant lightning. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain slid down the glass 37 stories above Midtown, turning the city skyline into blurred streaks of silver and smoke. Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and leaned back in his chair slowly, deliberately, making sure every eye in the room stayed fixed on him. "Careful with that pen," he added with a smile thin enough to cut glass. "Deals this large tend to overwhelm people who didn't grow up around real money." A few executives lowered their eyes. Others smirked into their champagne. Somewhere near the rear media platform, someone whispered the word awkward beneath their breath. Naomi heard all of it. Every laugh, every shifting chair, every tiny sound people made when they believed power belonged to them forever. But her expression never changed. She simply looked at Richard Whitmore across the long marble signing table while the cameras continued flashing against the polished walls. The room smelled faintly of espresso, expensive cologne, and rain carried in from Park Avenue. A giant digital screen behind the stage displayed the merger headline in glowing gold letters. Carter Nexus plus Whitmore Capital. $75 billion strategic acquisition. History in the making. That was what every business network in America had called it all week. Naomi slowly reached for the pen again. Her fingers were steady. That unsettled Richard more than anger would have. "You know," Evelyn Pierce said from the investor section, crossing one elegant leg over the other, "this merger really is extraordinary for a company like yours. Most startups never get invited into rooms like this." The wording hung in the air like perfume hiding poison beneath sweetness. "Company like yours." Naomi recognized the language instantly. She had heard versions of it since she was 14 years old delivering groceries on the east side of Detroit, while her mother worked overnight shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. Polite disrespect always sounded calmer than open hatred. That was what made it dangerous. Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward Evelyn. Calm, controlled, impossible to read. "And yet," she said quietly, "here I am." The ballroom fell still for half a second. Not because her words were loud, but because of the way she said them. No trembling, no apology, just truth laid flat on the table between billionaires. Richard gave a dry laugh and turned toward the press cameras lining the rear wall. "Confidence," he said. "I'll give her that." More scattered laughter followed. Naomi let them have it. Let the room breathe in its own arrogance. Above her, crystal chandeliers reflected across the black marble table like fractured stars. Daniel Reeves, Carter Nexus's CFO, sat 3 seats away silently flipping through the final merger packet again. His forehead tightened slightly as his eyes paused over one page longer than before. Naomi noticed. She noticed everything. The hesitation in Daniel's breathing. The nervous tapping from Whitmore's lead counsel. The SEC observers near the side entrance quietly exchanging glances. The storm outside darkened the windows another shade. Richard leaned forward at last, sliding the signature page toward Naomi with the tip of one finger. "Go ahead," he said smoothly. "Make history." Naomi looked down at the paper. Then slowly, almost gently, she closed the folder instead. The click of leather against marble echoed through the silent ballroom louder than anyone expected. And suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. For a moment, nobody in the ballroom understood what had just happened. The silence felt too heavy to be accidental. Naomi Carter kept one hand resting on the closed merger folder while the massive digital screen behind her continued glowing gold against the darkened room. Rain pressed harder against the glass walls overlooking Manhattan, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons beneath the storm clouds rolling over the Hudson. Richard Whitmore's smile faded slightly at the corners, not fully disappearing, but tightening enough for people close to him to notice. He was a man used to immediate obedience. Deals moved when he spoke. Markets shifted when he raised an eyebrow. Yet Naomi stood completely still across from him, calm enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Near the back of the ballroom, reporters lowered their cameras one by one. The constant clicking finally stopped. Daniel Reeves slowly looked up from the merger packet in front of him. His fingers remained pressed against page 74, where a single paragraph sat highlighted in pale gray beneath the conference lighting. Naomi noticed the exact moment realization began creeping across his face. She had been waiting for it. Richard leaned back in his chair again, forcing out a soft laugh, meant to recover control of the room. "What is this?" he asked smoothly. "A negotiation tactic?" Naomi finally removed her hand from the folder. "No," she replied quietly. "It is called reading the contract." Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn Pierce narrowed her eyes. The ballroom suddenly felt smaller than before, tighter, warmer beneath the chandeliers. Naomi turned slightly toward the giant windows lining the eastern wall, and for half a second the reflection staring back at her was not the woman standing in a custom charcoal suit before America's wealthiest investors. It was a tired 17-year-old girl sitting cross-legged on the cold floor of an office lobby in downtown Detroit, while her mother emptied trash cans after midnight. Naomi could still remember the smell of industrial cleaner on her mother's hands, the aching buzz of fluorescent lights, the security guards who barely looked at them unless they wanted them gone. Back then, she used to wait for her mother after school inside the lobby of a financial building that looked almost identical to this one. Marble floors, gold elevators, men in $1,000 coats walking past without seeing either of them. One winter night, Naomi had wandered too close to a private conference room where executives celebrated a merger worth billions. She remembered staring through the glass doors at the polished shoes, the expensive watches, the effortless confidence of people who never worried about rent or grocery money. A white security guard noticed her within seconds. "You cannot stand here," he told her flatly. "This area is not for people like you." Naomi never forgot those words. Not because they hurt her, because of how casually he said them. Like it was obvious. Like the world had already agreed. Years later, she built Carter Nexus inside a cramped garage with second-hand servers humming beside stacks of unpaid bills. She coded software during the day and delivered food at night. Investors ignored her emails for almost 3 years straight. Some rejected her within minutes of seeing her photo. Others asked if there was a more experienced executive handling the company behind the scenes. Naomi learned quickly that intelligence alone never frightened powerful people. Confidence did, especially when it came from someone they never expected to possess it. Back in the ballroom, thunder rolled faintly outside above the city skyline. Richard tapped the table once with impatience. "Miss Carter," he said coldly, "you are delaying a $75 billion transaction in front of federal observers and the entire financial press. I strongly suggest you explain yourself." Naomi slowly turned toward him again. Her face remained unreadable beneath the white conference lights. Then she slid one single page out from the merger folder and placed it carefully on the marble table between them. "I plan to," she said softly, starting with the clause your lawyers hoped nobody would notice. The page slid across the marble table with almost no sound at all, yet every person in the ballroom watched it like something dangerous had just been placed between them. Richard Whitmore glanced down briefly before looking back at Naomi with controlled irritation. "You halted a global merger over one paragraph?" he asked. "That depends," Naomi replied calmly. "Do you normally transfer corporate control through hidden synthetic voting triggers, or was tonight supposed to be special?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. Daniel Reeves straightened in his chair and grabbed the full merger packet again, flipping pages faster now, his fingers no longer steady. Across the investor section, two attorneys exchanged quick looks before leaning toward each other in tense whispers. Naomi noticed that too. She noticed everything. The tiny cracks always appeared before powerful people realized they were losing control. Richard forced out another smile, though it no longer reached his eyes. "That clause is standard acquisition protection," he said smoothly. "Every major investment group in New York uses language like that." "No," Naomi answered. "They do not." Silence again. Heavy this time. Outside the towering windows, lightning flashed somewhere beyond the Hudson River, bleaching the skyline white for half a second before darkness rolled back over the city. Naomi placed both hands lightly against the edge of the table and looked directly at the federal observers seated near the side entrance. Section 14, subsection C, she said evenly. The clause transfers emergency proxy authority to Whitmore Capital through synthetic share conversion during any projected market instability event. One of the observers frowned immediately and opened his copy of the agreement. Daniel's breathing slowed as he reread the paragraph again. Then his face changed completely. Richard saw it happen. That authority would only activate under extraordinary circumstances. Richard interrupted sharply. Naomi turned toward him. You classified a 3% stock fluctuation as an extraordinary circumstance. Nobody spoke after that. Somewhere near the media platform, a glass touched the floor softly beside a reporter's chair. No one even looked toward the sound. Evelyn Pierce leaned forward now, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light. This is becoming unnecessarily dramatic, she said coldly. Your company needed this merger to survive the fourth quarter. Naomi held her gaze without blinking. My company needed partners, she said quietly. Not owners pretending to be partners. Daniel finally closed the contract slowly. The sound echoed through the ballroom harder than expected. He removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose while tension spread visibly across his face. Richard, he said carefully, why was the trigger threshold lowered from 12% to 3%? Richard's jaw tightened for the first time all evening. Because market volatility has changed since the draft review, he answered. That adjustment was legal. Legal does not mean ethical, Naomi replied. Richard laughed once under his breath. Ethics, he said. This is Wall Street, Naomi, not a church. A few investors chuckled nervously, but the sound died almost immediately. The room no longer belonged to them the way it had 20 minutes earlier. Naomi could feel the shift happening in real time. It moved quietly, like ice cracking beneath expensive shoes. She stepped away from the table at last and walked slowly toward the giant digital screen glowing behind the stage. The white conference lights reflected against the polished floor beneath her heels while reporters raised their cameras again, sensing something larger than a merger collapsing in front of them. Naomi stopped beside the screen and folded her hands calmly in front of her. You are right about one thing, Richard, she said softly. This is Wall Street. Her eyes moved across the room, from the investors to the attorneys to the federal observers silently reviewing their contracts again. And people here mistake silence for weakness every single day. Richard's smile disappeared completely now. Naomi looked directly at him beneath the burning white lights. Then she pressed a single button on the presentation remote in her hand. The merger screen behind her vanished instantly. In its place appeared a confidential timeline labeled Internal Transfer Execution Strategy. And suddenly, every camera in the ballroom pointed at Whitmore Capital instead of her. The screen behind Naomi Carter glowed cold blue against the dark ballroom walls while the words Internal Transfer Execution Strategy stretched across 40 feet of digital display like something never meant to be seen outside a private boardroom. For several seconds, nobody moved. The only sound came from the rain striking the towering glass windows overlooking Manhattan and the distant hum of camera equipment near the press platform. Richard Whitmore stared at the screen without blinking. A detailed timeline now filled the display beside his company logo. Phase 1. Minority Position Acquisition. Phase 2. Synthetic Voting Conversion. Phase 3. Executive Restructuring. Phase 4. Founder Removal. Daniel Reeves slowly rose from his chair. Founder removal, he repeated quietly. His voice barely carried across the ballroom, yet everyone heard it. Naomi remained perfectly still near the stage lights. Page 92, she said calmly. The internal draft your legal team accidentally uploaded to the shared review server 3 days ago. Richard finally stood. The sudden movement broke the paralysis gripping the room. This is confidential material, he snapped sharply. You had no authorization to present internal strategy documents publicly. Naomi turned toward him without the slightest trace of panic. Neither did your firm when you inserted hidden control clauses into my company's merger agreement. Several reporters immediately began typing furiously into phones and tablets. The mood in the ballroom shifted again, faster this time. Investors who had spent the evening lounging comfortably in velvet chairs now sat forward with visible tension in their faces. One attorney whispered urgently into an earpiece while another closed his laptop altogether. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was disappearing piece by piece. Naomi could almost feel it draining beneath the chandelier light. Richard walked around the marble table slowly, straightening his jacket as though composure alone could restore authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, forcing control back into his voice. "This is precisely why emotional leadership creates instability in billion-dollar negotiations." Naomi said nothing. Richard continued, "Carefully. Miss Carter built an impressive company. Yes, but this reaction proves exactly why Whitmore Capital needed stronger governance protections in place." Evelyn Pierce nodded immediately beside him. "Markets require discipline," she added, "not personal sensitivity." Naomi looked at both of them for a long moment. Then she glanced toward the Federal observers seated near the side entrance. One of them was now reviewing the displayed documents line by line with visible concern. Another had stepped away quietly to make a phone call. Richard noticed that too. For the first time all evening, uncertainty flickered across his face. Tiny, fast, but real. Naomi stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her heels clicking softly against the polished black floor. "You keep calling this emotional," she said evenly. "But emotions are temporary." Her eyes moved toward the massive screen behind her. This was strategic. The room went silent again. Naomi picked up the presentation remote from the podium and pressed another button. A new slide appeared instantly. This one contained email excerpts, timestamps, and internal communications between Whitmore executives. One line glowed bright yellow across the center of the screen. "Once Carter signs, we phase her out within 6 months." Another line appeared beneath it. "Keep her comfortable until control transfers." A low murmur spread across the ballroom immediately. Someone near the press section whispered, "Oh my God." Daniel removed his glasses again, staring at the screen like he no longer recognized the people sitting beside him. Richard's face hardened completely now. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," he said coldly. "No," Naomi answered softly. "You made one the second you assumed I would sit quietly at my own execution." The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Even the rain outside seemed quieter afterward. Richard looked around the ballroom and finally understood what had changed. Nobody was watching Naomi anymore. They were watching him. The cameras, the investors, the lawyers, the Federal observers near the side wall. Every eye in the room had shifted direction at once. Naomi saw the realization settle into his face slowly like ice forming across dark water. Then one of the Federal officials stood up and closed his folder carefully. "Mr. Whitmore," he said evenly, "we are going to need copies of every internal communication related to this transaction immediately." And suddenly, the $75 billion merger was no longer the biggest story in the room. The ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. The low music that had been drifting through hidden ceiling speakers earlier now felt distant beneath the growing storm of whispers spreading across the room. Phones lit up everywhere. Reporters moved quickly between tables while camera crews adjusted angles toward Richard Whitmore instead of the stage backdrop, displaying the collapsed merger. Naomi Carter stood motionless beneath the white conference lights, calm in a room that was beginning to panic around her. One of Whitmore Capital's attorneys rushed toward Richard and leaned close enough to whisper urgently into his ear. Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the glowing screen behind Naomi, where the internal emails remained frozen for everyone to see. "Founder removal. Keep her comfortable until control transfers." The words felt radioactive now. Daniel Reeves slowly stepped away from the investor table entirely. The movement drew attention instantly. Naomi watched him loosen his ties slightly, as though the ballroom itself had become harder to breathe inside. "Daniel," Richard said sharply, "sit down." Daniel looked at him for several long seconds before answering. "Did you know about the 6-month removal plan before bringing me into this negotiation?" Richard's silence lasted too long. That alone was enough. A murmur spread across the executives seated near the front rows. One investor quietly closed his portfolio binder. Another reached for his phone with visible tension in his hands. Naomi remained perfectly still while the entire room tilted further away from Whitmore Capital in real time. Richard finally straightened his shoulders and turned toward the audience again, forcing composure back into his expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced. Smoothly, You are witnessing a founder protecting her ego at the expense of market stability. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, almost thoughtfully, before looking back up at him. Interesting, she said softly. You call fraud stability. Several people near the media platform reacted immediately. Naomi could hear keyboards clicking faster now. Headlines were already being written. Richard took a step closer toward the stage, his polished shoes reflecting against the black marble floor beneath the chandelier light. You built a software company, he said coldly. Do not pretend you understand institutional finance better than people who have controlled this market for 30 years. There it was. Not anger. Not panic. Something older. The same quiet belief Naomi had spent her entire life facing in rooms like this one. You do not belong here. The rain outside intensified, streaking harder against the glass skyline behind them. Naomi folded her hands calmly in front of her. You are right, she said. I did not inherit boardrooms. Richard's jaw tightened. Naomi continued before he could interrupt. I inherited debt collectors calling during dinner. Silence. I inherited watching my mother clean offices owned by men who never learned her name. Nobody in the ballroom moved now. Even the reporters seemed frozen beneath the soft white lights. Naomi took one slow step forward. So when your legal team hid transfer triggers inside this merger, she said evenly, you assumed I would feel lucky just to be invited into the room. Richard laughed once under his breath, but it sounded forced now. Thin. Cracking. This is emotional theater, he replied. Naomi looked directly into his eyes. No, she said quietly. This is pattern recognition. Daniel closed his eyes briefly at that. Somewhere behind the investor section, one of the Federal observers requested additional documentation through his phone, while another quietly photographed the presentation screen. Richard saw it happen. The control he carried into the ballroom was slipping away piece by piece, and for the first time all night, he could not stop it. Evelyn Pierce suddenly stood from her chair. Enough, she snapped. This merger is suspended until legal review is completed. Naomi turned toward her slowly. Suspended? She repeated softly. No. Every eye shifted back toward her instantly. Naomi picked up the black leather merger folder from the marble table and closed it completely. The sound echoed across the silent ballroom like a final decision. Carter Nexus is withdrawing permanently. The words landed heavier than thunder outside the windows. Several investors immediately began speaking over one another. One reporter nearly knocked over a chair rushing toward the media aisle. Richard stared at Naomi in disbelief. You cannot walk away from $75 billion, he said. Naomi held his gaze without blinking. Watch me. For several seconds after Naomi Carter spoke, the ballroom forgot how to breathe. The city lights outside the towering glass walls blurred beneath sheets of rain, while the massive merger screen behind the stage still glowed cold blue across the silent room. Carter Nexus is withdrawing permanently. The sentence lingered over the marble floor like smoke after a fire. Richard Whitmore stood completely still near the investor table, his face caught somewhere between disbelief and fury, but Naomi no longer looked at him. She simply turned away from the stage and stepped down slowly into the dim aisle between the press rows, while camera flashes exploded around her from every direction. Nobody tried to stop her. Not the lawyers. Not the investors. Not even the Federal observers still gathering documents near the side entrance. The power inside the room had shifted too completely now. Naomi walked past reporters shouting questions she did not answer. Her heels struck the polished floor with soft, steady rhythm beneath the chandeliers overhead. Outside the ballroom doors, the noise faded immediately. The long corridor beyond was quiet except for the distant hum of elevators and rain tapping against the skyscraper windows overlooking Midtown. Naomi finally exhaled once she was alone. Not deeply, just enough to release the pressure she had been holding inside her chest for the last 3 hours. She loosened the collar of her charcoal suit slightly and walked toward the far end of the hallway where the hotel rooftop access doors stood beneath a glowing exit sign. The rooftop was cold and almost empty. Rain drifted sideways across the Manhattan skyline, while helicopters moved like tiny blinking lights above the dark river beyond the city. Naomi stepped beneath the overhang near the edge of the building and rested both hands lightly against the wet steel railing. 37 floors below, yellow taxis crawled through rain-soaked streets like lines of fire beneath the storm. Her reflection stared back at her faintly through the glass tower beside the rooftop terrace. Calm face. Tired eyes. She barely recognized the woman standing there sometimes. Behind her, the rooftop door opened quietly. Daniel Reeves stepped outside, holding his suit jacket over one arm. He stopped several feet away, careful not to invade the silence Naomi had created around herself. "They are calling emergency legal meetings downstairs," he said softly. Naomi kept her eyes on the skyline. "I assumed they would." Rainwater rolled slowly down the steel railing beneath her fingertips. Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Did you know all along?" Naomi finally looked toward him. "About the transfer strategy?" Daniel nodded once. "I suspected it 2 weeks ago," she answered. "I confirmed it 3 days ago." Daniel stared at her quietly beneath the rooftop lights. "Then why walk into that ballroom tonight at all?" Thunder rolled faintly somewhere over the Hudson. Naomi turned back toward the city again. "Because men like Richard only expose themselves when they believe they already own you." Daniel lowered his eyes after that. The words hit him harder than he expected. The rain softened slightly around them, drifting into mist against the rooftop glass. For a while neither of them spoke. The city hummed below like a living machine made of light and noise and ambition. Naomi closed her eyes briefly as memories moved through her mind again. Her mother sitting exhausted at a tiny kitchen table counting dollar bills after midnight. Old winter coats drying beside broken radiators. The sound of vacuum cleaners echoing. Through office towers where powerful men walked past without ever seeing the people cleaning behind them. "My mother used to tell me something," Naomi said quietly. Daniel looked toward her again. "She said rich people rush silence because silence gives other people time to think." The rooftop wind carried the words away almost as soon as she spoke them. Daniel slipped one hand into his pocket slowly. "You could have signed the deal," he admitted. "Most people would have." Naomi gave the smallest shake of her head. "No," she said softly. "Most people just get tired of fighting rooms that were designed to erase them." Down below, Manhattan glowed silver beneath the rain while the storm clouds slowly drifted east across the sleeping city. And for the first time all night, Naomi Carter allowed herself to stand still without needing to prove she belonged anywhere at all. The rooftop door opened again nearly 20 minutes later, but this time the movement carried none of the confidence that had filled the ballroom earlier that evening. Richard Whitmore stepped out slowly into the rain-soaked air with no cameras beside him, no attorneys whispering into his ear, no investors orbiting around him like satellites around a fixed sun. Just a 70-year-old billionaire standing beneath a gray Manhattan sky that suddenly looked much larger than he remembered. Naomi Carter did not turn around immediately. She remained near the steel railing overlooking the glowing city while rain drifted softly through the rooftop lights around her. Daniel Reeves glanced once between them before quietly stepping back toward the rooftop entrance, sensing this conversation no longer belonged to him. Richard watched Daniel disappear through the door before speaking. "The Federal Review team is freezing every transfer tied to the merger," he said at last. Naomi gave a small nod as though the outcome surprised her less than the weather. Richard loosened his tie slowly. His hands no longer looked steady. "Our stock dropped 11% in after-hours trading." Naomi remained silent. The city below them pulsed with headlights and reflected rainwater, while helicopters drifted slowly above the river like blinking ghosts through the storm clouds. Richard moved closer beneath the rooftop overhang, careful to stay several feet away from her. "You planned this carefully," he admitted quietly. Naomi finally looked toward him. "No," she said softly. "I prepared carefully." The distinction landed harder than Richard expected. He lowered his eyes briefly toward the wet concrete beneath his polished shoes. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the skyline again. "You embarrassed me in front of half of Wall Street," he said after a long silence. Naomi studied him calmly beneath the rooftop lights. "You tried to erase me in front of all of it." Richard opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. For the first time since the evening began, he seemed unsure what version of himself remained standing there. The sharp investor. The untouchable billionaire. The man who always controlled the room. None of them felt convincing anymore beneath the cold rain and silver skyline. Naomi turned back toward the city again. "Do you know what the strange thing is?" she asked quietly. Richard looked at her without speaking. "I expected the manipulation." Rain tapped softly against the steel railing beside her hands. I expected the hidden clauses, the transfer triggers, the strategy meetings. She paused briefly. What I did not expect was how comfortable all of you were laughing before you thought I understood the game. Richard closed his eyes for a second after hearing that. Just 1 second. But Naomi noticed. Powerful people always revealed themselves in the smallest moments. The rooftop wind shifted around them, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt high above Manhattan. Richard stared out across the skyline now, shoulders heavier than before. You think this is about race, he said quietly, though there was less certainty in his voice than earlier. Naomi looked at him carefully. I think men who spend their lives being listened to stop noticing who they interrupt. Silence settled between them again. Not hostile this time, just honest. Richard rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw while the city glowed beneath the storm. When you walked into that ballroom tonight, he admitted, I assumed you would take the deal no matter what we put in front of you. Naomi gave the smallest nod. I know. Richard looked toward her again, and for the first time all evening there was no performance left in his expression. No polished arrogance. No practiced authority. Just fatigue and realization arriving far too late. That was my mistake, he said quietly. Naomi held his gaze for several long seconds beneath the rooftop lights. Then she asked the question he had avoided all night. Why did you think I would accept it? Richard did not answer immediately. Rain slid down the edge of the steel railing between them, while traffic crawled silently through the streets far below. Finally, he looked away first. Because people usually do, he admitted. Naomi breathed out slowly through her nose. Not anger. Not victory. Something sadder than both. That, she said softly, is why tonight mattered. Richard stood motionless beside her while the rain drifted over Manhattan, and the silence between them no longer belonged to power, but to truth. The rain had almost stopped by the time Richard Whitmore finally spoke again. Tiny drops still clung to the steel railing along the rooftop edge, catching silver reflections from the Manhattan skyline below, but the storm itself had begun drifting east across the river. Naomi Carter stood quietly beside the glass wall overlooking the city while cold wind moved softly through the rooftop lights around them. Richard looked older now than he had inside the ballroom earlier that evening. Not weaker, just stripped of something he had relied on for too many years. The board is demanding damage control, he said quietly. Naomi remained still. They want a statement before the markets open. A helicopter passed slowly above the Hudson, its red signal light blinking through the clouds before disappearing into the dark. Richard lowered his eyes toward the wet concrete beneath them. If the investigation expands, he continued carefully, Whitmore Capital could lose half its institutional partners by morning. Naomi studied him in silence for several seconds. Then she asked softly, "And what do you want?" Richard looked genuinely surprised by the question. The rooftop wind pressed lightly against his rain-damp suit jacket, while traffic lights flickered below like scattered fire across the streets of Manhattan. I spent 30 years believing control was the same thing as leadership, he admitted at last. Tonight was the first time anyone ever forced me to question that publicly. Naomi watched him carefully. The arrogance that had filled his voice earlier was gone completely now. What remained sounded unfamiliar even to him. Honest. When my father built Whitmore Capital, Richard continued quietly. He used to tell me the market only respected strength. He gave a tired laugh beneath his breath. I think somewhere along the way I stopped understanding the difference between strength and dominance. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the cold steel railing beside her. Far below them, the city kept moving exactly as it always did. Yellow cabs, late trains, office towers glowing through the rain. New York never paused long enough to mourn anyone's pride. Richard reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. The board prepared this statement downstairs, he said. They want me to release it before sunrise. Naomi glanced toward the page, but did not take it. Richard unfolded it himself beneath the rooftop lights. His eyes moved briefly across the words before he spoke again. It blames a communication misunderstanding during merger negotiations. Naomi looked at him without expression. Richard exhaled quietly and folded the statement again. It is a lie. Silence settled between them once more, softer now than before. Richard stared out across the skyline, while the last traces of rain slid down the glass towers surrounding them. You know, he said slowly, when you first walked into that ballroom tonight, All I saw was someone younger than me trying to protect her company. He looked toward Naomi again. I never stopped to consider I might be the one people needed protection from. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly after hearing that. The words did not sound polished enough to be manipulation anymore. They sounded expensive in a different way, like truth finally costing something. Richard stepped closer to the rooftop railing, though still careful to leave distance between them. I cannot undo what happened tonight, he admitted, but I can tell the truth about it. Naomi studied him for a long moment beneath the dim rooftop lights. Why? She asked softly. Richard gave a faint shake of his head. Because if I walk back into that building and protect myself the way I always have, he said quietly, then everything you said about men like me becomes permanent. The city wind carried the words into the night around them. Naomi looked out across Manhattan again, while dawn slowly threatened the edges of the clouds far beyond the river. For the first time since the evening began, she no longer saw Richard Whitmore as untouchable. Just human. Flawed. Late. But human. Richard unfolded the statement one final time. Then slowly, carefully, he tore the paper in half. The pieces slipped from his hands and disappeared into the wet rooftop darkness below, while neither of them spoke another word. By the time Naomi Carter stepped back inside the Manhattan Regent Hotel, dawn had begun softening the edges of the city beyond the towering glass windows. The ballroom downstairs was nearly empty now. Most of the reporters had already rushed toward early morning broadcasts. Investor tables sat abandoned beneath dim chandelier light, half-filled water glasses still reflecting silver against the marble floors where the $75 billion merger had collapsed only hours earlier. The giant digital screen behind the stage had gone dark. No glowing headlines remained. No polished slogans about history or partnership. Just silence settling over a room that suddenly looked much smaller, without power performing inside it. Naomi walked slowly through the corridor leading toward the private elevators, her charcoal suit still carrying faint traces of rooftop rain. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor while exhausted hotel staff quietly reset chairs and folded linens around her. Nobody stopped her now. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Near the ballroom entrance, a maintenance worker struggled to steady a rolling cart loaded with collapsed display panels and tangled electrical cords. One wheel caught awkwardly against the edge of the carpet, causing several metal poles to slide sideways toward the floor. Naomi stepped forward instinctively and caught one before it fell. The older man looked up immediately, startled. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly. Naomi gave him a small smile and helped steady the cart without saying anything else. His gray uniform carried the hotel logo stitched over one pocket, slightly faded from years of washing. For a brief second, the memory of her mother flashed through Naomi's mind again. Late nights, service hallways, cleaning supplies rattling inside plastic carts while wealthy strangers walked past without ever looking down. The worker nodded once more before continuing down the hallway alone beneath the dim morning lights. Naomi watched him disappear around the corner. Then she kept walking. The private elevator doors opened with a soft chime as she approached. Inside, mirrored walls reflected the tiredness beneath her eyes more honestly than cameras ever had. She pressed the lobby button and leaned lightly against the polished steel wall while the elevator descended through 37 floors of sleeping luxury. Somewhere around the 20th floor, her phone vibrated quietly for the first time in almost an hour. Naomi glanced down at the screen. Hundreds of notifications flooded across it. Financial networks, emergency board requests, interview offers, market alerts. One message sat above all the others. From Daniel Reeves. "You changed more than the deal tonight." Naomi stared at the message for several seconds before locking the phone again without replying. The elevator doors finally opened into the main hotel lobby, where dawn light poured softly through towering glass windows facing Park Avenue. The storm had passed completely now. Outside, the sidewalks glistened silver beneath the early morning sky, while taxis rolled slowly through puddles left behind by the rain. Naomi crossed the lobby quietly, passing businessmen half asleep beside coffee stands and hotel staff preparing for another endless New York morning. Near the revolving front doors, she noticed Richard Whitmore standing alone beside the window overlooking the street. No attorneys, no investors, no assistants carrying phones behind him. just an aging man in a dark suit watching the city wake up around him. He turned slightly as Naomi approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard gave the smallest nod. Not performative, not strategic, just human. Naomi returned the nod once before continuing toward